G'day, it's Rowan from Ferguson Brothers Rail and welcome to the channel. In this video I'm going to walk through scratch building the process of our version of the Wells Viaduct in Georgia. It started when we saw this article in a magazine. Wells Viaduct in Georgia, 1500 feet long and 200 feet high. We only have one vertical drop on our layout, so this sounded like a pretty cool feature. Part 1, modelling the pier. Let's start by looking at some source photography. V12 Productions kindly allowed me to include some of these shots in our film. These detailed drone shots were incredibly useful for our reference. Looking at this shot, it seems as though each layer contains 3 courses. I'm only guessing here, but it makes sense that they poured courses in layers while moving up scaffolding, possibly even constructing the scaffolding while moving vertically higher. The closest I can easily get to mimic those courses in N scale is 3mm MDF. The plan is to build a model of the largest pier, then we can reuse it for each of the piers. We have to scale ours down in length to fit the space, so ours will have 9 concrete piers instead of the 10 in real life. Once I've cut out all the pieces, I'm gluing them together with a very small dab of glue per piece. This will be enough to hold them all together while cutting the overall pyramid shape. Then I'll pull them all apart again, which will be easy since there's only a small amount of glue. We don't want to make the mould from a perfectly cut pyramid because there won't be any texture in the model. I gotta say, I hate working with MDF. It makes an absolute mess. You have to wear a decent respirator as this stuff makes very fine dust. I mark a line so I have a key for reassembling the pieces later. I'm splitting them apart so I can gently sand the sharp edges of each piece. Then I'll reassemble them into groups of 3. The edges for each glued group of 3 will be sanded a little extra, so we end up with distinct layers with 3 courses each. Part 2, mould and casting. You can see the separate top piece in this shot. Far safer to glue these together later to keep the demoulding process as simple as possible. The outer box is held together with screws, so it's easy to reassemble after demoulding each pour. After measuring the volume with water, I'm ready to mix up the silicone. I screwed a piece of wood across the top to stop the model floating up. Compressed air just helps here.
Well, I got to say I'm pretty happy with that. Took a little bit of coercion to get the mould out, but it came out. I've just screwed this back together again now. You can see how I'm reusing this box to offer structure for the silicone. So when we pour the plaster of Paris in there, it's got something to rest against and take the weight, so we get a nice straight side. All the marks that I built into the model have come through in the mould. I can feel that. Hopefully that'll come through nicely when we do the plaster of Paris. Something to note, there's a lot more air bubbles in this piece, and I mixed this up in a small cup, probably mix it more vigorously, and I think I've introduced more air. Now I don't have a compression chamber. I didn't want to go to that investment just to do one piece. So I'll just knock those off with a blunt chisel and a bit of sandpaper. Should be fine, but just interesting to note, I mixed this one up in a much larger vessel with a big stirring stick and didn't get many bubbles in this one at all.
I'm using colour hardener powders to tint the plaster of Paris. This stuff is used to tint real concrete. You could also use paints or something a little less industrial. I'm using these 4 colours to get it to a warm, slightly green-grey colour, which will suit our final scene. To save on plaster and keep them lighter, I use pieces of foam. After they're fully dry, I'm applying watered down coats of brown umber and oranges to get the rust streaks. I finished by sponging on the darker colours. Finally, I added a black wash to help accentuate the cracks and crevices. I also airbrushed some green wash around the base of the piers to help them blend in with the forest. When that was all dry, I painted on a layer of watered down Mod Podge matte to seal the paintwork. To make a base to sit across the piers, we used a couple strips of flat bar welded together. While not prototypically accurate, this was the easiest way to achieve a solid base for our track, and it looked fine in the end. Part 3, Sculpting the Terrain. If you're interested in our floating benchwork approach and the advantages this offers, check out the video. The 7mm MDF baseboard you can see here slides out, so theoretically we can remove the entire diorama just by cutting the track. We're using a heap of XPS to build up the layers. You can see Cody here gluing pieces into place. I used the bandsaw for chopping up pieces and the scroll saw for the detailed tunnel pieces.
Well, you can see we've done a bit more work on the foam here. We've started building up the train for this hill that's going to go over the swinging gate, which rotates and joins together nice and seamlessly. This piece on this side is secured solidly, but this one on this side will be held down with magnets. So if we need to, we can access underneath, just in case this gate needs replacing or we need to do something different with this later on. Want to make sure that we don't glue everything down and make it harder to deal with that later. So a couple of magnets under here glued into the XPS will hold this down. Now for all this gluing of this more important stuff here, where we've got really tight important corners, we're using a different type of glue. We use the wood glue to build up the layers because there's plenty more time for it to glue and dry up. But for these corners here, we're using a different type of glue, and I'll show you what we're using there. For these detailed spots here where accuracy and strength is really important, we're not using wood glue, we're using this Gorilla Glue, which is a different chemical makeup. You smear on one surface, spray the other surface with water, run them together, clamp the two objects together, and then after a couple of hours it's foamed up and created a really strong bond. You do need to weigh the two surfaces together because the foam that is created in the curing process will push the surfaces apart. So, but highly recommend this stuff for gluing XPS foam. This is basically a bastard file in circular shape that spins at 1,000,000 miles an hour. This is what I'm going to use to carve the foam. We're about to make a whole lot of mess.
The mess was worse than what looks here. To be honest, if I did this again, I'd use a knife. Unfortunately, I'd already glued it in, so taking it outside wasn't practical. However, I did use the foam shavings to economise the first layer of sculptor mould. The foam shavings were a good aggregate to bulk out the main gaps, then we used regular sculpt mould to do the final layer. Part 4, Painting the Terrain. We did a brown base coat over everything. You can see in these shots, we've worked the terrain around the height of each pier, then blended the terrain together to form a valley. One of the biggest challenges was doing this convincingly with very shallow depth. In addition, there's actually a tunnel behind all this for a lower level track loop. I made a separate video on painting the plastic tunnel portal. This is basically a layered approach using a range of colours and washes to suit the fairly lush terrain we're modelling. I started building up the colour against the brown, first black, then a range of oranges and oxides. It's a very organic process. I'm mostly looking to exaggerate shaded or shadowy areas. When a diorama will only ever be seen in unnatural light, you have to enhance light and shadow sometimes to fake the realism of natural light. The first texture layer was a mixture of tan coloured grout and fine dirt. A diluted Mod Podge layer is enough to hold it. The second texture layer includes a blend of ground cover. After adding the ground turf, I added some streaks of gloss varnish to simulate moisture leaking from the rocks. I used a brown gap filler to glue the piers down, using the track plate as a measuring tool to get them in the perfect position. I then built up the texture around them to blend them seamlessly into the terrain. In this case, I dyed the sculptor mould to minimise the effort of blending this fresh sculptor mould into the surrounding scenery. Part 5, Backdrop Painting. We use 7mm MDF for the backdrop, so it's rigid enough to hold its shape without being glued to the wall. The whole thing slots behind a space we intentionally left behind the foam scenery. I double coat the sides and edges with primer sealer first. This is important to prevent swelling as MDF and moisture don't mix.
Got some paint set up, bucket of water, some dry brushes for blending. I've got 2 rollers that I'm going to use for the 2 main colours. And I'm using rollers so I can get the paint down very quickly, so there's time to blend it all before they start to dry. Now over here a bit, I've got a Pico backdrop poster. They come in 3 sections and make up 2.4 metres. We decided not to use this because we don't have to buy these things and put them around the whole train room. So I'd rather mix up the same shade of blue and then paint it myself.
Okay, so the challenge here is to work quickly while the paint is wet. I'm running 2 strips of colour close together first, then I use the first brush to blend them together, then I use a wide dry brush to start dragging the colours together horizontally. I have one for the blue, then another ready for the white. Then I use the paint roller to run along the edge, particularly the top that will be visible. Next I'll paint the layers, working from the lightest to the darkest. I've already decided that I want 3 layers, so I can start darkening the previous paints until I get to the foreground that'll have a lot more green to match the trees. I use a bit of foam to reduce the obvious brush strokes. Half the time I'm just figuring this stuff out as I go. I decided to use a tree for stenciling in some forest texture into the scene while using different shades of greens with a tiny bit of yellow. When it was dry, I used my minigun to spray some semi-opaque white. This just softened the overall scene and helped add a cloudy consistency to glue it all together. You could also use an airbrush for this. The minigun's just a bit quicker.
Okay, so the next step here is to paint the foreground on the distant mountains, the mid-mountains, and now the foreground is going to go right behind the trees. The trees go right up to this backdrop. So we want to try and colour match this final layer with the trees themselves. So it looks like the forest behind the trees goes back into the distance. It'll also help to hide the shadow of the 3D trees. So I've also measured the height of a standard tree, just so I can run this guide along to get the sort of rough height where to paint to. Might be a bit hard to see here, but I'm just adding a tiny little bit of yellow with the sponge just to add a little bit of variegation to the colour, so it just makes it look a little bit more dynamic and 3-dimensional.
like the light's catching on some of it. We're not going to really see much of it, but if you look at the trees we've been making, they do have some little specks of highlight, so hopefully that'll help it match. The foreground ended up being a little too dark. If it annoys me enough, I can easily lift it back out to repaint later. Part 6, scenery detailing. Tree making was by far the biggest job on this project. It's the reason I haven't published a video for so long. I've covered tree making in a separate video, so I'll fly over the basics. We basically used garden twine spun around wire for the shape, then it's sprayed with paint, sprinkled with foam flock, and finished with some highlights to add light and variation. We've got just under 400 trees in this scene, a lot of work, but it really creates the scene. For the river, I found some suitable rocks from the garden to use as boulders and glued them down first. I want them to be a single colour first, starting with brown, then through to darker washes, and finish with green in some spots for the moss. When that was completely dry, and any other elements like the deer, I poured the resin. The resin will wick into surrounding porous materials, like the flocking, and then dry shiny. We really don't want this, so I'll hide it as best as I can by gluing down more flock, or sometimes by painting matte varnish over objects like the exposed rocks. This helps reduce the glossy reflections, which give away the realism. For the rusty girder walls of the bridge, I modelled a single panel in Blender. It's about 2.5mm deep, 16mm wide, and 19mm high. From the single panel, I created a series of arrays which essentially multiplied the panel enough times for each span. The fiddliest part here was that my 3D resin printer bed isn't big enough for the longer spans, so I had to print them in 2 pieces, then glue together. After a black base coat with Rust-Oleum, I gave them a couple coats of deep reddish brown, then sponged on some lighter colour to add texture. You can see the comparison here. There were around 18 pieces, so this took a few hours. For the rust patina finish, I'm using dirty down rust after stirring it thoroughly with a skewer. The first coat is watered down, and I'll add more once the panels are installed on the model. Once we glued down the track, I thought I'd try the Woodland Scenics Rusty Track Painter. It took a while to get it going, but it did a pretty good job. Finally, we added a few extra details like the water pipe, electrical wire, and some extra rust to glue it all together. Next we'll get the swinging gate finished, and then it'll be time to move on to custom switch panels for our turnouts. If there's anything you want to see in more detail, like the 3D modelling and printing, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to support the channel by subscribing, and we hope to see you soon.